She only asked for a blanket, but the flight attendant looked her up and down and said no. Cold words, cold heart. What she didn't know? That woman's daughter was sitting just a few rows behind, and she owns the airline. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upcoming story. Margaret stepped onto the plane slowly, holding her worn leather purse in one hand and a small carry-on in the other. Her steps were careful, her posture graceful, though her eyes showed signs of age and long journeys. Her coat was buttoned neatly up to her neck, but the chill in the cabin still made her fingers curl tighter around the strap of her bag. She paused at seat 2A, glanced at her ticket, then sat down gently. The seat felt soft, the space wide, the quiet comfort of first class. She placed her bag beneath the seat in front of her and folded her hands on her lap, trying to settle in. Near the front of the cabin, the lead flight attendant, Brooke, watched from her post. She had a sharp uniform, polished shoes, and a face that always seemed to carry a shadow of impatience. Her eyes moved across the cabin until they landed on Margaret. Older, black, quiet, and alone. Brooke's gaze lingered, her expression unreadable. She tilted her head slightly as if something didn't fit. But she said nothing. Not yet. Margaret leaned back, pulled the thin blanket from the seat, and unfolded it across her knees. It barely reached. The cold air brushed against her ankles. She hesitated for a moment, then pressed the service button. It lit up with a soft ding. She waited, eyes still on her lap. Brooke arrived with a tight smile. Yes? Her voice was polite but cold. Margaret looked up with a small nod. Sorry to bother you. It's a little cold. Could I have an extra blanket, please? Brooke stared at her for half a second longer than necessary. We only give one per passenger, she said simply, then turned away before Margaret could say anything more. The older woman watched her walk down the aisle, her hands still folded neatly in her lap. She didn't sigh, didn't roll her eyes, didn't press the button again. She simply sat back and looked out the window. Across the aisle, a man in a dark gray suit, Grant, looked up from his phone. He'd seen what just happened, and for a moment his jaw tightened. But he said nothing. He lowered his eyes and tapped the screen again, pretending to scroll. 2 rows behind Margaret, someone else had been watching. Delilah, young, confident, dressed in black slacks and a cream blouse, her hair tied back into a low bun. She had a tablet in one hand, a phone in the other. She hadn't looked away once since Margaret asked for that blanket, and now her thumb moved quickly over the screen. A message was sent. No emotion crossed her face. She just set the phone face down on the tray in front of her and stared straight ahead. Brooke continued down the aisle, offering drinks, adjusting tray tables, smiling widely at the couple in 2C and 2D. Can I get you anything else? She asked them sweetly. Oh, absolutely, I'll bring you another one. She passed by Margaret again without a glance. Margaret stayed silent. Her hands remained still, her face calm, though something behind her eyes had changed. It wasn't anger, it was something else. Heavier, older. The kind of quiet built from years of moments like this. Small humiliations no one else seemed to notice. The plane doors closed. The captain's voice echoed gently through the cabin. The usual safety instructions played. Engines began to stir beneath the floor, but the real shift had already begun. And Brooke, still smiling, still handing out drinks and jokes, had no idea that the woman she had just dismissed had more power behind her than she could ever imagine. As the plane lifted into the air, Margaret sat quietly in her seat, eyes closed, her hands resting on the blanket folded neatly across her knees. She hadn't spoken another word since the flight began. Her calm didn't change, but something in the air around her had. It was the silence of someone who had seen too much, who had learned long ago that sometimes the best response was no response at all. Delilah remained in her seat 2 rows behind, not touching her drink, not watching the movie screen in front of her. Her eyes were fixed forward. She had seen how Brooke treated her mother. Because yes, Margaret wasn't just a random passenger. She was Delilah's mother. And this wasn't the first time she had watched her mother be treated like she didn't belong, but it was going to be the last. Delilah picked up her phone again and sent another message, this time to someone inside the airline's executive team. Simple. Director. Notify the captain. I want the flight supervisor in the cockpit in 5 minutes. Use my name. Brooke walked past again, this time glancing at Margaret just briefly. Still no request, no argument, no reaction. It bothered her. In a strange way, she had expected a little resistance. A comment, a complaint, something to justify the coldness she had shown. But the woman just sat there like none of it mattered. That silence started to press on Brooke's nerves. Near the cockpit, a chime rang. One of the co-pilots picked up the call, nodded once, and turned toward the captain. We just got a message from Ground Command. Delilah Monroe is on this flight. She's requesting immediate communication. The captain looked up sharply. Monroe? As in? The co-pilot nodded. Yes, that Monroe. The atmosphere inside the cockpit changed instantly. The captain adjusted his headset and opened the private channel. Get the lead attendant up here now. Brooke was mid-sentence with another passenger when the junior flight attendant, Hannah, approached and tapped her gently on the arm. The captain needs to speak with you. Right now. Brooke frowned. About what? Hannah didn't answer, just stepped back and motioned toward the cockpit. Passengers glanced up, sensing something shift. Brooke straightened her jacket and made her way to the front, heels clicking softly on the aisle floor. She had no idea who Delilah was. She had no idea she was being summoned not because of a safety issue, but because someone far above her had just started watching. As the door to the cockpit clicked shut behind her, Margaret remained in her seat, staring quietly out the window. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but she already knew. Delilah was handling it, and Brooke had just walked into a storm. Brooke stepped into the cockpit, confused but trying not to show it. The captain didn't offer a smile. He didn't even stand. He simply looked at her with a calm, unreadable expression and said, Do you know who Delilah Monroe is? Brooke hesitated. No, sir. Should I? The captain leaned forward slightly. She's the CEO of this airline, and she's sitting in 4B. You just walked past her 3 times. The words hit like a slap. Brooke blinked, her throat tightening. I wasn't aware. She didn't introduce herself. She wasn't supposed to, the captain replied. She was here as a passenger, quiet, private. But now she's watching you closely. Brooke's chest began to rise and fall faster. Did I do something wrong? The captain tilted his head. That's what we're going to find out, because she just sent a direct message to the operations team, and it had your name in it. Brooke's stomach dropped. Her voice came out strained. What did I do? The captain's gaze sharpened. Do you remember refusing an extra blanket to a passenger in 2A? Brooke's mouth opened, but no words came. The moment flashed in her mind. The cold tone, the dismissive glance, the way she turned her back before the woman could reply. I didn't mean anything by it, she said quickly. It's just policy. No, it's not, the captain cut in. And even if it was, the way you handled it wasn't policy. You embarrassed a first-class passenger, one who turns out to be the mother of the woman who owns this entire airline. Brooke felt her knees weaken. Her mother? The captain leaned back slowly. You've got 10 minutes to explain your behavior, but I can already tell you, Delilah doesn't seem like someone who accepts excuses. Brooke swallowed hard. The walls of the cockpit felt tighter now. Her confidence, so sharp just minutes ago, had started to break. She nodded stiffly and turned to leave, trying to keep her steps steady. Back in the cabin, Margaret still sat quietly, her expression unchanged, but her silence now felt like steel. The kind of silence that didn't ask for justice, because it expected it. Delilah hadn't moved either. She sipped water, set her tablet aside, and waited. Everyone else on that plane was still unaware of what was coming, but for Brooke, Her flight had just started heading in a very different direction. Brooke stepped out of the cockpit, her face pale, her hands tightening around the sides of her skirt. The same aisle she had confidently walked just moments earlier now felt longer, heavier. Passengers were still quietly sipping drinks, flipping through magazines, unaware that something serious was unfolding just feet away from them. As she passed row 2, Brooke's eyes flicked toward Margaret, still seated, still silent, still looking out the window as if none of this involved her. But something about her stillness unsettled Brooke now. Before, it felt dismissible. Now it felt powerful. She continued past Margaret, trying not to make eye contact, and then paused at row 4. There sat Delilah, calm, alert, watching, not angry, just steady, like someone who didn't need to raise their voice to change everything around them. Brooke managed a polite smile. "Miss Monroe, I'm very sorry. I didn't know—" Delilah held up one hand just slightly. "Sit down," she said quietly. Brooke blinked. I'm still on duty, ma'am." Delilah didn't raise her voice. "I said sit down." The tone was enough to make a few passengers glance up. Brooke hesitated, then slowly slid into the empty seat across the aisle. Her spine was straight, but her hands were shaking slightly. Delilah leaned forward just a little. "I didn't come on this flight to be noticed. I wasn't here to test anyone, but you failed anyway." Brooke swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was just a misunderstanding." "No," Delilah said flatly. "It wasn't. It was a decision. You looked at my mother. You judged her. You decided she didn't belong." Brooke opened her mouth to speak, but Delilah didn't stop. She asked for something simple, a blanket, and instead of helping her, you chose to humiliate her in front of everyone. You walked away like she didn't matter. Delilah's voice remained calm, but there was something under it. Something cold, final. "I've spent my life watching people treat her like she's invisible. But this time you did it on my plane, under my company, wearing my uniform." Brooke's shoulders slowly sank. She could feel the walls closing in. Delilah didn't blink. "You thought no one was watching. You were wrong." Margaret hadn't moved from her seat, but she didn't need to. Everything she'd ever wanted to say was now being said for her, by the one person in the world who never let her be treated like less. Brooke sat frozen, unsure what to say, unsure if there was anything left to say, and the flight still had hours to go. Brooke stayed seated across from Delilah, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Her voice, usually crisp and commanding in the cabin, was gone. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, to say it had been a long day, that maybe she hadn't realized how her words came across. But none of those excuses seemed safe to speak out loud. Delilah didn't look away. Her expression didn't soften. "You know what's sad?" she said quietly. "If she had been loud, if she had raised her voice or caused a scene, you probably would have taken her more seriously. But because she stayed quiet, you felt safe dismissing her." Brooke flinched, but Delilah continued. "You didn't just break company policy. You broke the one rule we don't ever forgive. Disrespect." Brooke's mouth opened, then closed. Her breath came out shaky. "I didn't mean to—" Delilah cut her off without raising her voice. "Yes, you did. That's the part you need to admit to yourself. You saw an older black woman sitting alone in first class, and you assumed something didn't add up. You assumed she didn't belong." Brooke's throat tightened. It wasn't about race. Delilah's eyes sharpened. Then what was it about? Her age? Her clothes? The way she didn't try to impress you? Pick one. Either way, you saw her and made a decision. One that had nothing to do with her ticket or her manners or our policy. Around them, passengers were beginning to notice the tension. Some tried not to stare, others whispered softly, exchanging glances. The air had shifted in first class. Something heavy now hung between the rows, though no one dared speak it aloud. Margaret sat in her seat, still gazing at the clouds outside the window. Her face was calm, but her hands were folded tightly together in her lap. She could hear the quiet exchange between her daughter and the flight attendant. And though she said nothing, she knew every word was landing exactly where it needed to. Brooke leaned forward slightly, her voice trembling. "Please, I've worked for this airline for almost 9 years. I've had perfect evaluations. I've trained new staff. I've never been written up." Delilah nodded slowly. "And you thought that would protect you?" Brooke looked away. Delilah didn't. "That's the problem," she said. "You believed you were above consequences. You believed that kindness was optional. That policy could be used to cover bias." Brooke's lip quivered slightly. "I can apologize to her." "You should," Delilah said, "but not because you want to fix this. Not because you're trying to keep your job. You should apologize because you were wrong. And you should know, an apology doesn't cancel consequences." Brooke looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you firing me?" Delilah leaned back in her seat. "Not yet, but the flight isn't over." Then she stood and walked down the aisle, leaving Brooke sitting there, small, quiet, and for the first time in years, powerless. Passengers watched Delilah pass, unsure exactly who she was, but sensing clearly that the balance of control in the cabin had shifted. She stopped at her mother's seat, placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and spoke softly. Margaret turned, looked at her daughter, and gave her the smallest nod, a signal between them, filled with unspoken understanding, and then Delilah returned to her seat. Brooke remained still, frozen in the same place, staring ahead at nothing, as the sound of the engines hummed beneath the rising tension in the air. What she didn't know, what she hadn't realized yet, was that this was just the beginning of her fall. The cabin settled into an uncomfortable quiet. Passengers shifted in their seats, pretending to read or watch movies, but their attention kept drifting to the front of the plane. Everyone had felt it. The cold shift in the air, the heavy silence after Delilah walked away. Something serious had happened, and though no one knew the full story, they knew enough to stay silent and pay attention. Brooke remained seated across from where Delilah had been. Her shoulders were stiff, her jaw clenched. Her hands rested on her knees, but the tension in her fingers made them shake slightly. She wasn't used to sitting. She was used to moving, giving instructions, controlling the rhythm of the flight. But now, she sat like a passenger without purpose, waiting for something she couldn't control. The junior attendant, Hannah, peeked down the aisle from the galley. She looked unsure whether to approach or stay back. She had seen Brooke run that cabin with confidence and control, and now she watched her shrink into herself, nervous and still. Hannah slowly walked forward and leaned down near her. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Brooke didn't answer right away. She blinked rapidly like she was trying to hold something in. "Do you know who she is?" she finally whispered. Hannah nodded. "Delilah Monroe. I didn't recognize her at first, but I do now." Brooke exhaled slowly. "I didn't know. I just thought she was another passenger." "She is a passenger," Hannah said, "and so is her mother." Brooke's face tightened. "It was just a blanket. I didn't think—" "You didn't think she mattered," Hannah said, her voice quiet but sharp. Then she straightened and walked away, leaving Brooke with the sting of those words hanging in the air. Back in her seat, Delilah scrolled through her messages. A notification popped up, a report from the ground team confirming the incident had been logged. She replied with a simple instruction: "Wait until landing. I'll decide then." She didn't look angry. In fact, she looked calm, composed, but that was the part that terrified people the most. Delilah didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply watched, remembered, and acted when it mattered. And everyone who had worked in the airline long enough knew, when Delilah got involved, things didn't end quietly. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat, pulling the blanket up to her waist again. She wasn't cold anymore. Not because the cabin had warmed, but because she could feel her daughter's presence behind her. A quiet shield. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Across the aisle, the man in the gray suit, Grant, had stopped pretending to read. He watched Brooke from over his glasses. He had seen it all. The refusal, the way she turned her back on the older woman. And now, the result of that mistake unfolding in silence. He reached down and turned off the screen in front of him. Whatever movie he had picked wasn't going to be more interesting than what was happening right here. Brooke finally stood up, moving stiffly toward the front galley, trying to collect herself. She passed by Margaret, and for the first time their eyes met. Brooke hesitated. Her mouth opened slightly like she wanted to speak. But Margaret's gaze was steady, not angry, not hurt, but disappointed in a way that made Brooke's chest tighten. She looked away and kept walking. In the galley, she splashed cold water on her face from a bottle, trying to calm her nerves. Her hands trembled. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had been with the airline for almost a decade. She had memorized policies, trained new crew members, earned seniority. One mistake, one moment of coldness, and it was all slipping out of her hands. She looked down the aisle toward Delilah, who was now sipping water and reading from a folder in her lap. Calm, quiet, untouched by the storm she had already started. Brooke turned away, her heart pounding harder than it had in years. She had seen other crew members removed before. She had reported some herself, but this time she was the one being watched, judged, measured. And she knew. She didn't measure up. The flight wasn't halfway through. The seatbelt sign was off. The passengers were still, but the air inside the cabin kept getting heavier. Brooke leaned against the wall of the galley and closed her eyes. Because now she understood the truth. This wasn't just a mistake. This was the beginning of the end. The hours in the air felt longer than they ever had before. Every time Brooke tried to move about the cabin, she felt eyes following her. Some passengers looked at her with curiosity, some with judgment, and others with quiet pity. She wasn't used to being the one under the spotlight. Normally, she was the one correcting others, reminding them of protocol, keeping things in order. But now, she walked with forced calm, her hands clasped behind her back, her throat dry every time she passed row 2. Margaret hadn't said a single word since boarding. She hadn't touched the call button again. She just sat with her hands folded, her eyes drifting between the window and the seat in front of her. But she knew. She knew the effect her silence was having. It was louder than any complaint could have been. Her dignity hadn't moved. Her quiet had power, and now the entire crew was feeling it. Back in row 4, Delilah closed the folder on her lap and placed it carefully inside her carry-on. Her phone vibrated once. She checked the screen. A message from her assistant. Operations ready to receive report after landing. We're standing by. She didn't reply. She just locked the screen and placed the phone face down again. Delilah's eyes moved slowly over the cabin. She saw the nervous glances, the forced small talk, the way some passengers were pretending not to notice what was happening. But she also saw the change, the small, subtle shift. People who had ignored her mother earlier were now seeing her, not just as an older woman in a coat, but as someone who had been wronged. Grant, the man in the gray suit, stood and walked toward the lavatory. As he passed Margaret's row, he paused. Then he turned slightly and said in a quiet voice, "If you ever need another blanket, ma'am, I'd be happy to give you mine." He smiled, kind but awkward. Margaret looked at him, gave a slight nod, then turned back to the window. It wasn't much, but it was something. A small act of respect. And for a moment, Grant looked like he was ashamed it had taken him this long to say it. Meanwhile, in the rear galley, Brooke stood frozen, staring at the intercom button above her. She wanted to call the captain again. She wanted to explain, to ask for help, to fix something before it all collapsed. But she knew it was too late. The message had already gone above her. Her name had been spoken by someone whose name carried more weight than anything in the crew manual. There were no checklists for what came next. She looked at her reflection in the metal edge of the galley cabinet. Her eyes looked tired, older. Her usual poise was gone. The voice in her head that used to say, "You're in control." It had gone quiet, too. She remembered Margaret's eyes, the way they didn't blink when they met hers. It wasn't anger. It was history. It was the look of someone who had carried years of this kind of treatment, and chose this time not to carry it alone. Brooke felt the pressure rising in her chest again. She stepped out of the galley, smoothed her uniform, and walked back to the cabin. As she passed seat 2A, she slowed. Margaret didn't turn this time. She didn't acknowledge her at all. Brooke bent slightly. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for how I treated you earlier. It wasn't right." Margaret didn't look at her, didn't speak, but that silence said everything. Brooke straightened and continued walking. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to forgive, the kind that didn't owe her anything. Delilah watched from her seat. She had seen it, the half apology, the quiet discomfort, the way her mother didn't respond. And she knew what it meant. Margaret didn't want revenge. She wasn't here to embarrass anyone. She had lived through worse. But Delilah, she had built an empire to make sure no one like her mother would ever have to live through it again. And now that empire was watching. The plane continued to cruise at 35,000 feet, but Brooke felt like she was falling. Each step she took toward the back of the cabin pulled her further from the job she had once loved, from the person she had once believed herself to be. Passengers returned to their routines, but something had changed permanently in that cabin. Everyone could feel it, and Brooke, for the first time, had no idea what would be waiting for her once the wheels touched the ground. The sun began to sink beneath the clouds, casting a soft orange hue over the wing of the plane. The gentle shift in light made the cabin seem quieter, almost frozen in time. Meal trays were cleared, cabin lights were dimmed. The usual chatter had faded to a hush, but the tension remained, silent, pressing, just beneath the surface. Brooke sat alone in the crew jump seat near the rear of the plane. She had been told to remove herself from passenger service for the remainder of the flight. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a quiet order passed down from the captain after his second call with operations. Her headset had been taken, her access to announcements revoked. She was still in uniform, but she wasn't part of the crew anymore. Not really. She kept her eyes low, watching the floor beneath her feet as if answers might appear there. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she kept folding them tightly together in her lap, as if she could hide the panic bubbling inside. A few hours ago, she had felt untouchable. Senior crew, years of experience, recognition from management. She was the one who others came to for guidance. Now, no one even looked at her. Across the cabin, Delilah remained calm. Her face was unreadable. She glanced at her mother now and then, the way Margaret sat with her chin lifted, her hands neatly clasped, not a hint of stress in her expression. Margaret hadn't said a word to her. She didn't need to. Delilah had seen everything she needed to in that short interaction with Brooke, and Margaret's silence carried more weight than any speech could have. Margaret wasn't a fragile woman. She had raised children during times when people like her were told they didn't belong in rooms they had earned. She had worked long hours, taken long buses, been talked down to, overlooked, and ignored. But she had never bowed her head. Not then. Not now. Delilah checked her phone again. Another update from her assistant. HR has flagged the incident. Legal is preparing an internal report. Want us to loop in media relations? She didn't respond. Not yet. She had already made her decision. But she wasn't going to speak it through a screen. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure your tray tables are up." A few passengers stirred, stretching, adjusting their seats, the usual signs of a flight nearing its end. But for Brooke, that announcement wasn't routine. It was a warning. In the back of the plane, she could feel the shift. Something final was coming. She had been through landings hundreds of times, but this one felt different. Her career, her reputation, everything she had built. It was hanging in the balance. And she had no control anymore. Hannah walked past her without stopping. No eye contact, no conversation, just quiet distance. Brooke had once trained her, taught her how to handle difficult passengers, corrected her uniform when it was wrinkled. But now, Hannah moved like Brooke didn't exist, and maybe she didn't. not in the eyes of the company anymore. Back in row 2, Margaret calmly buckled her seatbelt. She smoothed the edge of her coat and took a deep breath, her face still serene. She had always handled people like Brooke with grace, never giving them the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. But this time, something was different. This time, her daughter had power. Delilah leaned forward, fastening her own seatbelt, then glanced at the forward galley. 2 uniformed ground staff had just stepped into the cabin from the jet bridge, visible through the tiny window in the locked door. They weren't there for routine work. She knew why they had come. She looked toward the rear of the plane where Brooke sat, unaware of who was waiting beyond that door. Still staring at the floor, still hoping that maybe, just maybe, she could talk her way out of it. But Delilah knew better. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. And the moment the wheels hit the ground, everything Brooke thought she still had would be taken from her, just like she tried to take someone's dignity without saying a single cruel word. The plane dipped lower. The cabin rumbled softly. And Brooke closed her eyes, not from exhaustion, but because she knew something was coming. Something she couldn't stop. The landing gear lowered with a low mechanical hum, and the cabin filled with that familiar soft vibration as the aircraft began its final descent. But for Brooke, each shift of the engine felt like a countdown. The sound that once signaled routine was now the drumbeat to the end of something she couldn't get back. She sat frozen in her jump seat, belt fastened tight, hands clenched in her lap. Her gaze stayed fixed on the bulkhead wall in front of her, but her thoughts were spinning so fast she couldn't hold on to any one of them. Her mouth was dry. Her chest felt tight. She had run through a dozen versions of what she would say once the plane landed, but none of them seemed strong enough to change what was already in motion. The captain's voice came back, calm and professional. "Welcome, everyone, to our destination. Local time is 6:42 p.m. For your safety, please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us." The plane touched down with a soft jolt. Passengers gave the usual half-hearted claps. A few stretched, some pulled out their phones. But unlike most flights, no one stood up right away. There was something in the air, thick, still, charged. In first class, Margaret remained perfectly still, hands folded over her purse, gaze straight ahead. She wasn't rushing to deplane. She wasn't even looking at her daughter. She just sat, proud and silent, as if she already knew what would happen next. Delilah unlocked her seatbelt and stood slowly. She didn't rush to grab her things. Instead, she pulled out her phone and sent one final message. Then she placed it in her pocket, turned slightly, and waited. The front door of the aircraft opened with a sharp click. The air from the jet bridge felt cooler, brisk, fresh. But what entered next made the whole cabin still. 2 ground operations officers stepped aboard. Both wore dark jackets with airline credentials clipped at the chest. Behind them stood a woman in a gray blazer holding a folder, and a security officer in plain clothes. Their steps were firm, deliberate, practiced. Not a single sound came from the first-class cabin as passengers watched them enter. Hannah looked toward the back of the plane where Brooke sat. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The silence between crew members now carried more than any announcement could. The uniformed officers walked directly toward the rear without glancing at anyone else. Passengers parted slightly as they passed, some shifting to the side, others pretending to be focused on overhead bins, but their eyes kept flicking back. When they reached Brooke, she didn't look surprised. She looked defeated. Slowly, she stood, straightened her uniform with trembling hands, and nodded without being asked. The woman in the blazer spoke first, her voice low but firm. "Miss Carter, you're being escorted to the operations office for review of an incident that occurred during this flight. Please bring your personal belongings." Brooke swallowed, her voice caught. "Can I speak with someone first?" The woman shook her head. "That time has passed." Brooke reached up, pulled her suitcase from the crew storage, and turned. She walked the length of the cabin slowly, aware of every eye that followed her. No one whispered now. No one offered her a kind smile. There was no pretending anymore. Her removal was happening in full view. As she passed Margaret's row, she hesitated. Her eyes landed on the older woman for just a second. She opened her mouth, maybe to apologize again, maybe to explain. But Margaret didn't even glance at her. She continued staring ahead, hands still folded, face still calm. That silence once again cut sharper than anything Brooke had ever felt. Brooke turned her head and kept walking. The weight of the moment crushed down on her shoulders with every step. Delilah stood near the front, arms folded. She didn't smirk, she didn't gloat. She simply nodded at the woman leading the escort, then stepped aside. Brooke paused just for a second, facing Delilah now, the woman whose name she hadn't known, whose face she had passed without notice. Now, she would never forget it. "I didn't know," Brooke whispered. Delilah looked at her without blinking. "That's the problem." Brooke felt her throat tighten. Her hands trembled as she followed the officers down the jet bridge, her steps heavy and slow. The door closed behind them. The remaining passengers exhaled, some quietly murmuring. The tension hadn't left, but now it had somewhere to go. Margaret finally turned toward her daughter and gave her a quiet look. Not proud, not relieved, just understood. Delilah gave a slight nod and sat back down. Outside the plane, Brooke walked the long hallway toward a private terminal door. No passengers followed. No crew walked beside her. It was just her, and the silence she had created for herself. She could still feel the plane behind her, the quiet judgment of people she didn't know, the silence of the one woman she couldn't forget. And she knew, even without hearing it said, that her life was about to change forever. Not because someone powerful wanted revenge, but because someone quiet had finally been seen. The hallway outside the plane felt longer than it had ever been. Brooke walked slowly between the two ground security officers, the soft scuff of her shoes the only sound echoing off the sterile white walls. She didn't ask questions. She didn't try to explain. The words had dried up somewhere between the cabin and the gate, along with the last shreds of pride she was still holding onto. She thought of her last few flights, all the time she had taken command of difficult situations, solved passenger disputes, kept the crew in line, enforced the rules. She had always been the one in charge, the one who knew what to say. But now she was walking like a trainee who had failed her first test. And she hadn't failed because she didn't know the rules. She had failed because she thought she was above them. They reached a side corridor near the operations office, a quiet area away from the usual airport noise. A sign overhead read, "Crew access only." It wasn't a place passengers ever saw. It was meant for internal matters, situations that didn't need public attention. But this time, it didn't matter. Everyone on that plane had already witnessed enough. A woman stood waiting by the office door, mid-40s, smartly dressed, holding a thin folder in her hand. Her name badge read, Rebecca Lynn, Senior Flight Supervisor. Her expression was unreadable. She had reviewed dozens of incidents in her career, misconduct, delays, even mid-air emergencies. But this one was different. This one had come from the very top. "Miss Carter," Rebecca said without looking up from her folder. "Come with me." Brooke followed silently into a small conference room. It was clean, cold, and quiet. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a frosted window that faced nothing. The walls felt like they were closing in. She sat stiffly, waiting for Rebecca to speak, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Rebecca sat down, opened the folder, and flipped through several pages. Then she looked up, her tone flat. "You've been with us how long?" "Almost 9 years," Brooke replied, her voice small. 9 years, Rebecca repeated, like she was measuring the weight of it. "No major write-ups, 3 internal awards, and senior status." She closed the folder slowly, which makes what happened today even more disappointing. Brooke's mouth went dry. She tried to keep her voice steady. "I made a mistake. I know that. But Rebecca raised a hand. "This isn't a conversation. I'm not here to ask for your side. I've already received the flight report, the security log, and a personal statement from Miss Monroe. Brooke's heart skipped. She submitted a statement? Rebecca's eyes didn't waver. She owns the airline. She doesn't need to submit anything. Her word is enough. Silence settled in the room. Brooke could hear her own heartbeat. Her ears rang. She wanted to say something, anything that could shift this in her favor. But every excuse that came to mind sounded hollow now. Rebecca folded her hands on the table. Do you remember what you said to the passenger in 2A? Brooke nodded slowly. She asked for an extra blanket. I told her it wasn't allowed. And did you say it that way? Brooke hesitated. Number I was short with her. I didn't think. That's the problem, Rebecca said, her tone sharp now. You didn't think. You didn't stop to wonder why she asked. You didn't question whether you could make an exception. You saw her, judged her, and dismissed her. Brooke looked down. I didn't know she was related to anyone important. Rebecca stared at her for a long moment. And if she hadn't been? The question cut deeper than any lecture. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. You're not in this room because you embarrassed the owner's mother. You're in this room because you treated a passenger without kindness, without fairness, and without a second thought. The fact that she was connected to Delilah Monroe only made it visible. But even if she hadn't been, what you did would still be wrong. Brooke felt something shift in her chest, something sharp and painful. Because deep down she knew that was true. If Margaret had just been another elderly black woman traveling alone, she would have gone unnoticed. Her request dismissed, her discomfort ignored. And Brooke wouldn't have thought about it again. Rebecca reached for a final sheet of paper. This is your termination notice, effective immediately. You will not return to active flight duty. Your name is being added to the conduct watch list, and a permanent record of this incident will be shared with partner airlines. Brooke's lips parted slightly. So I'm done? Rebecca's answer was simple. Yes. The final word felt like the closing of a door, not just on her job, but on everything she had built over nearly a decade. She had climbed the ranks, earned trust, led teams, and in one careless moment she had thrown it all away. She reached for the pen and signed the form with a shaking hand. Rebecca took it back without another word. You'll be escorted to collect your belongings, she said, and then to the exit. Brooke nodded, eyes burning. Rebecca stood, opened the door, and motioned for the officers. Brooke followed them out, her head lowered, her hands limp at her sides. She passed familiar halls, familiar faces, some looking at her, some looking away. All of them knew. Her badge would be deactivated before she even left the building. Her name would be wiped from the internal roster, and every airline that mattered would already have her flagged. Not because she made a loud mistake, but because she made a quiet one that reflected something worse. That deep, silent belief that some people mattered less than others. And now she was no longer one of the people who mattered at all. The echo of Brooke's footsteps filled the staff hallway as she followed the two security officers toward the crew locker room. She had walked this path hundreds of times before, passing through these doors at the start of every shift. Badge swinging at her hip, uniform pressed to perfection, head held high. This time, her head was bowed, her arms hung heavy by her sides, and her footsteps dragged slightly, like each step took more effort than the last. She passed a group of junior crew members near the vending machines. They looked up when they saw her, their laughter fading into silence. One of them, a woman Brooke had once mentored during her first month on the job, gave a nervous nod of recognition. Brooke didn't return it. She couldn't. The shame in her chest pressed too hard against her ribs. Inside the locker room, her name was still on a small magnetic strip above her assigned unit. She opened it slowly, as if by moving gently, she could delay what was happening. Her extra uniform, flight log, crew guide, and the silver badge she had worn for nearly a decade all sat waiting, untouched. She reached in and picked up the badge. For a moment she just stared at it in her hand. The weight of it, the years it had represented, the authority it once gave her. She remembered the pride she'd felt the day she was promoted to senior flight attendant, the quiet celebration at the end of her shift, the email from her supervisor praising her calm in emergencies. She had built herself into someone important, someone respected, and now, in less than a day, it had all been erased. There were no tears. Not yet. Only silence. She took the badge off her uniform, placed it inside a small return envelope provided by the admin staff, and sealed it. Then she folded her extra uniform carefully and laid it on the bench, as if trying to hold onto a small piece of dignity. But no matter how neat her folding, no matter how controlled her expression, nothing could cover the truth. She wasn't leaving on her terms. One of the officers stood near the exit, giving her space but not leaving her sight. This wasn't about suspicion. It was about process. And everyone was watching closely to make sure it was followed exactly. Brooke zipped her personal bag and took one last look at her locker before shutting it slowly. The sound of the door clicking shut felt final, like a chapter being closed with no hope of returning to the previous page. She stepped back into the hallway, and the officers flanked her again. No one spoke. They led her through a service corridor toward a side entrance used for crew exits. No farewell, no debriefing, no thank you for your years of service. Just cold fluorescent lights and the hollow echo of her footsteps. As they neared the exit, a tall window offered a view of the main terminal. She could see passengers walking freely, laughing, arguing over baggage, waiting for their rides. Among them were people she had once looked down on. She had thought she stood above the crowd, part of the polished crew who moved through secure doors and private lounges. But now she was just another person walking out with no job, no clearance, and no way back. And then she saw them. Delilah and Margaret stood near the VIP pickup lane, a black sedan already waiting with the rear door open. Delilah was helping her mother into the car, her movements calm and respectful. Margaret didn't glance toward the terminal. She didn't need to. Her message had already been delivered. Delilah closed the door gently and turned toward the glass, not expecting to see Brooke, but seeing her nonetheless. Their eyes met across the distance. For a second, no one moved. Brooke didn't wave. She didn't mouth an apology. She simply stood there, bag slung over one shoulder, eyes heavy with regret. Delilah held her gaze, then gave the faintest nod, not of forgiveness, but of finality. Then she turned, stepped into the car, and pulled the door shut behind her. The sedan rolled forward, smooth and quiet, leaving Brooke standing alone behind the glass. She walked through the final door of the airport, not the exit reserved for passengers, but a side gate marked staff only, authorized personnel beyond this point. She didn't belong beyond that point anymore. The door shut behind her with a mechanical click. Outside, the city lights had begun to shimmer. The sky was dark, the wind light, the streets alive with people heading home from work. But Brooke had nowhere to go. She stood near the curb, blinking against the cool breeze, unsure whether to call a ride or keep walking. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out her phone, and opened her contacts list. Dozens of familiar names stared back at her. Co-workers, supervisors, training leads, crew coordinators, all people she had worked with, dined with, laughed with. She tapped on a few, sent short messages. "Can we talk? I need to explain. This isn't what it looks like." One by one they were read, and not a single one replied. She tried calling, straight to voicemail. Then she tried one final number. A friend from another airline, someone she had once spoken to proudly about switching careers, climbing the ladder. The voice on the other end answered, quiet and distant. "I'm sorry. I heard what happened. I don't think I can get involved." Click. Brooke stared at the screen. Her fingers hovered for a second, then dropped to her side. Her phone screen dimmed, then turned black. She stood alone on the edge of a world she used to command. Not because of an accident. Not because someone set her up, because she thought a woman like Margaret didn't belong. And now, it was Brooke who didn't belong. In the uniform, in the company, in the sky. Her power was gone. Her name erased, her legacy rewritten by a single moment of coldness. Brooke stood outside the airport doors, motionless as crowds buzzed past her. Families reunited with hugs, business travelers checking their watches, taxi drivers holding signs with names. Everything was moving. Everything except her. For a moment, she didn't even feel the cold. Her mind had disconnected from her body, like she was watching herself from the outside, watching the woman who had once strode through airports with authority, now standing in the wind with nowhere to go, nowhere to report, no one to call. She clutched the strap of her bag tighter, more for balance than comfort. Her knees felt weak, but she wouldn't sit down. Not here, not like this. She stepped off to the side near the edge of the curb, away from the arrivals lane. The airport she had called home for nearly a decade stood behind her, glowing under fluorescent lights. But it didn't feel familiar anymore. It felt foreign, unwelcoming. She wasn't part of it now. She was just another person standing outside the glass. Her phone buzzed again, a notification from the internal employee app. She opened it instinctively. A red bar flashed across the screen. Access denied. Your profile has been deactivated. Contact HR for questions. Brooke stared at it for a long time, then closed the app and turned off the phone completely. It was useless now. The connections she had spent years building, co-workers, captains, base managers, they would all see the termination memo by morning. It wouldn't just say she was fired. It would say why. And in aviation, reputation spread faster than flight schedules. She tried to tell herself that maybe, with time, she could explain. That someone, somewhere, might listen. But then the words Delilah had said replayed in her head. You thought no one was watching. You were wrong. And she had been. She had looked at Margaret and made a decision, one that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with prejudice. She didn't yell at her. She didn't insult her. She simply decided with a cold glance and a dismissive tone that Margaret didn't deserve the same care given to others. It was a quiet cruelty, the kind people never wrote down, but always remembered. A taxi pulled up in front of her and honked once. The driver leaned out the window. Need a ride, ma'am? Brooke hesitated, then shook her head. No, thank you. The driver shrugged and pulled away. She didn't know why she had said no. She had nowhere else to go. But something inside her couldn't handle the idea of sitting in the back of a car, staring out a window, trying to pretend she was still holding herself together. She wasn't. Not anymore. She sat on the cold metal bench near the edge of the sidewalk, the kind of place passengers only sat when they were waiting for someone else to arrive. Not when they were leaving with everything they owned in one bag. A group of flight attendants in fresh uniforms passed by her, laughing about something one of them said. They didn't recognize her. She was invisible now. Just another face. Just another figure in the background. She used to be part of that world. The crew rooms, the rosters, the briefings, the badge-activated doors. Now she was on the other side. She pulled her coat tighter around her and stared up at the airport sign above the doors. The name of the airline glowed in bright letters, letters she used to be proud to wear, letters that now represented the very system that had pushed her out, not unfairly, but justly. For years, Brooke had believed seniority meant safety. That experience made her untouchable. She had trained junior staff to follow policy without emotion. She had written up attendants for showing too much sympathy, or straying from protocol. But all along, she had mistaken power for value. And now, without the power, she had to face who she really was. The truth was, she hadn't just made a mistake. She had revealed herself. And Margaret, with her quiet strength, her patience, her refusal to be rattled, had revealed something else too. She had revealed what dignity looks like when it's been tested. She had revealed what it meant to rise above insult without ever needing to fight back. And Delilah? Delilah hadn't needed to raise her voice. She hadn't threatened, hadn't caused a scene. She had simply acted, decisively, silently, completely. It wasn't revenge. It was justice. Brooke lowered her head and let her eyes close for a moment. She wasn't tired. She was finished. Finished with pretending, finished with excuses, finished with believing that the uniform made her better than anyone else. She stayed on the bench long after the foot traffic thinned and the lights inside the airport dimmed. Eventually, she would have to get up. Eventually, she would need to face what came next. The calls, the emails, the questions from friends and family. But right now, she just sat in silence. Because for the first time in her life, there was nothing left to say. The hours melted into the cold pavement beneath her feet, the distant city lights flickering across the windshield of parked cars as the airport settled into its late-night rhythm. Fewer people passed now, mostly janitorial staff, red-eye passengers, and quiet crews beginning their graveyard shift. Brooke remained on the bench near the far curb, her bag resting at her side like a stranger's luggage. The ache in her lower back had grown sharper, and her hands were stiff from gripping the edge of the seat, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Not yet. Every part of her body screamed that she should go home, find warmth, call someone. But the truth was harsher than the wind cutting against her coat. She didn't know where home was anymore. Not in the emotional sense. The place she had anchored her identity for nearly 10 years had turned its back, and worse, it had been right to do so. For most of her adult life, Brooke had built herself inside that airport. She had given up weekends, holidays, relationships, all in the name of climbing the ranks. She didn't have children, didn't marry. She had traded those things for a sense of control, of value, that came with a pressed uniform and a full flight log. Her world had been structured, scheduled, predictable. And yet, none of that stopped it from collapsing in a single day. She thought about Margaret again, the woman whose only request had been a simple blanket. Not a luxury, not a special meal, not an upgrade, just warmth. And Brooke had denied her that without even blinking. She hadn't yelled, hadn't used slurs, hadn't made a scene. But she had stripped Margaret of comfort, of respect, of the basic human decency owed to any passenger. Because Margaret hadn't fit the picture Brooke had in her mind of who belonged in first class. And that was the hardest part to accept. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. She hadn't recognized the quiet pain in Margaret's eyes, hadn't noticed the years behind her posture, the grace in her silence. She had seen a woman sitting in a seat she didn't expect to see her in, and made a snap judgment. And for that, she had paid a price she couldn't afford. Her phone, still powered off, remained in her coat pocket. She didn't want to turn it back on, not yet. She wasn't ready to see the fallout, the news that would surely spread across crew group chats, private messages, and internal memos. There was no damage control now. Her name was already sinking in the industry. A car pulled up to the curb, not a rideshare or a taxi, but a sleek black SUV. The back window rolled down slowly, and for a moment, Brooke's heart skipped. She sat up straighter, unsure why, unsure who. It was Delilah. She sat inside the car with the window down halfway, her face calm, eyes unreadable. She said nothing at first, just looked at Brooke. That same quiet, composed stare that had dismantled Brooke's defenses earlier without needing to shout. Brooke stood slowly, unsure whether to approach. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. The cold air hung between them, filled with everything that had already been said. Delilah finally spoke. "You thought I was finished when you walked off that plane." Brooke swallowed hard. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I didn't plan to see you again," Delilah said. "But I needed to be sure." "Sure of what?" Brooke asked. Delilah's eyes narrowed slightly. "That you understood what really happened. That you don't just feel punished, but that you understand why." Brooke looked down. "I do." "Do you?" Delilah's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Because from where I'm sitting, all I saw today was a woman protecting her position, not acknowledging her reflection." Brooke blinked. "I was wrong," she said. "I know that now. I treated your mother unfairly. I saw her and I assumed. I judged her." Delilah nodded slowly. "And now that it cost you something, now it feels real." Brooke flinched. It wasn't about her being your mother. I didn't know who she was. That's the point, Delilah replied. You didn't know, and that's exactly why you thought you could get away with it. Long silence followed. Cars came and went. A luggage cart rattled nearby. Somewhere across the lot, a late bus hissed to a stop. But Brooke didn't move. Delilah's words clung to her ribs like ice. She couldn't defend herself anymore. Not here. Not in front of the woman who had built the very airline she was now banned from. Delilah exhaled. My mother doesn't need protection. She's endured more than you'll ever understand. But what she deserves, what every passenger deserves, is respect. And when people in positions of power forget that, they don't belong in the air. They belong out here. Brooke's throat burned. She nodded slowly. I know. Delilah gave one last look. I didn't ask for you to be humiliated. I asked for you to be reminded. Brooke said nothing. The window rolled up. The SUV pulled away. Brooke stood there a few seconds longer, watching the car fade into the distance, its taillights glowing red against the wet pavement. And when she finally sat back down on the bench, the weight in her chest had shifted. The shame remained, but something else had settled in. Not anger, not bitterness. Understanding. Real, painful, unmovable understanding. Because Delilah had been right. This hadn't been about punishment. It had been about truth. And Brooke had just been forced to see it, one layer at a time. Brooke remained seated on the bench long after the SUV had disappeared into the blur of traffic. The hum of tires against pavement faded. The wind tugged at the collar of her coat, and overhead, a plane lifted into the night sky, its lights blinking against the darkness. A world she once belonged to, now drifting further away. The silence returned, heavier this time. Not the kind of silence she had used to avoid accountability, but the kind that demanded it. She leaned forward slowly, resting her elbows on her knees, fingers laced tightly. Her body ached. The cold had settled into her bones. But what hurt more wasn't the weather or the loss of her job. It was the growing realization that this night, this moment, wasn't just an end. It was a mirror. And she was being forced to sit and stare into it. She began thinking about every moment she had dismissed someone quietly. The elderly man who stuttered when asking for assistance. The immigrant woman who spoke in broken English, too nervous to make eye contact. The young couple traveling with a crying child, whom she had treated with short answers and tighter smiles. All the people who didn't fit her version of a first-class traveler. She had never shouted, never insulted, but she had judged, and she had done it with professionalism so polished, it was hard for anyone to call it out.